Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Saleem, Daya, analyst with Nasdaq Corporate Solutions, to discuss institutional participation across cannabis names with broad-scale regulatory changes likely on the horizon. Saleem, it's great to see you again. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
You got it. And cannabis performance in the fourth quarter of 2020 was different than that of the third quarter. What's changed?
I mean, a really good question. And so for some context, we definitely saw cannabis names actually pull back a bit in the third quarter of 2020, around the region of 2.5%. The fourth quarter of 2020 was a massively different story, right? We saw the selective benchmark surge by about 52%, handily outperforming the S&P 500, which gained in relative terms a modest 12%. And even at a sector level, we saw cannabis names as a top performer at the end of the fourth quarter of 2020. Now, a lot of those gains were essentially concentrated in November, which is when we saw the state level ballot initiatives. Those ballot initiatives coincided with the US federal election and essentially saw the legalization of cannabis at the state level across major markets, including the likes of Arizona, Mississippi, South Dakota, New Jersey, and Montana, right? And so the key takeaway here is that the substantial gain that we observed across the sector was really on the back of regulatory momentum. And outside of simply just being legalization across a handful of states, the general consensus here from the investor community, at least, was that the legalization that we saw in November was essentially a prelude to wide and broad-scale cannabis reform, which many see as just around the corner.
How did the Canadian market perform relative to the United States?
Yeah, so a really good question as well. Historically, what we've generally seen is we've seen Canadian names generally lag as a performer on the selective benchmarks, essentially being outpaced by a lot of their US counterparts. That trend, which occurred until quite recently, effectively reversed in the fourth quarter of 2020. We've actually seen Canadian names converge with on the performance front with their US counterparts. And in our view, this is actually because the state level ballot initiatives that we saw in November would have prompted very substantial asset flows into major cannabis benchmarks, many of which are actually more heavily tilted towards Canadian dual listed names. And so those players no doubt would have gotten the lift. So much so that we actually saw Canadian players outperform their US counterparts, which is definitely a historical anomaly, by a modest 2% in the fourth quarter of 2020.
And Saleem, let's talk about what you're seeing in terms of asset flows. Are there any recurring trends there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for some context here, we've definitely seen assets move quite aggressively into the cannabis space. The ETF MG Alternative Harvest Index ETF, for example, notched about $240 million worth of inflows in the fourth quarter of 2020. Again, a lot of that activity was really concentrated in November on the back of those state level ballot initiatives, as well as some earnings releases, which also came out during that month. What's interesting is at the time in November, the daily inflows that we saw for the month were actually some of the largest that we had seen since around late 2019. What's even more interesting is since then, we've seen asset flow surged into the cannabis space, particularly in the first 2 weeks of January on the back of the Democratic Senate sweep. The ETF MG, for instance, saw about $200 million worth of inflows in those first 2 weeks. And again, that compares with the entire quarterly inflows of $240 million. Once more, we also saw another daily record is effectively set. We saw some of the highest daily inflows in January. The last time we saw that level of activity was essentially February of 2019. Shift a bit more towards the MSOs. MSOs is a US-based cannabis ETF that biases US exposure. We really saw that ETF notch about $180 million worth of inflows in Q4, and then 330 in the first 2 weeks of January on the back of that Democratic Senate sweep. So that effectively outpaced the ETF MG's quarterly inflows as well as their early January inflows. That really underscores a consistent and recurring trend that we see across cannabis names, and that's a general tilt on the part of investors towards US-based exposure.
And Saleem, here's an interesting question for you. With the substantial asset flows into cannabis ETFs, have bearish bets on the short interest side moved lower in response?
Yeah, so actually a really great question. So bearish bets across cannabis names have largely remained either flat or in line with their kind of March 2019 March 2019 lows. And when we consider that against the backdrop of asset flows, against the backdrop of benchmark performance, of options activity, and what we begin to observe on the ownership trends front, which we'll discuss shortly, it's quite clear that we're seeing more long-term assets come into the fore.
And that's a great way to segue into it. Let's wrap up talking about institutional ownership trends. Where is the activity concentrated?
Yeah, so a very good question. And so the key takeaway here is that we continue to see increased long-only institutional ownership across the cannabis space. Looking at our quarterly pulse, which we published in line with 13F filings data for the third quarter, for instance, for 2020, we definitely saw an increased preponderance of institutional buying across the 500 million plus market cap bucket. A lot of institutional names were essentially replacing the higher turnover, including kind of broker dealer names that we saw in the past as top buyers across the market cap bucket. Right, and when we look at where these institutional owners are actually concentrating their assets, again, the focus here is on a select U.S.-based names. So it's quite clear that institutions, in their eyes at least, are kind of picking winners and losers and really focusing on U.S.-based exposure. That's going to be a massive and recurring theme, I think, a dominant overarching theme for 2021, especially when we consider that Democratic Senate sweep.
Saleem, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks for your time.